Today we're talking about the ultimate monarch, the absolute rulers of France. And remember last time we started talking about Spain and how Spain's king, Philip II, became kind of the quintessential absolute ruler. He took control of the Spanish military, took control of the Spanish government, and sort of set himself up as the model, if you will, of absolute rulers. Now, as we talked last time, you remember what ended up happening to the Spanish Empire, and that they stretched themselves too thin. They hyperinflated their economy by bringing in way too much gold and silver from Europe, or from America, and not compensating by raising taxes. So consequently, the Spanish Empire was at this point kind of in decline. So shifting our focus from Spain, we're going to take a look at France and France's monarchs. And we really start that story off with the group of monarchs known as the Bourbons. So the Bourbons were the rulers of France for a very long time. In fact, the last French monarch, Louis XVI, he was also a Bourbon. So we start this story of the French ruling family with a man by the name of Henry of Navarre. Now, if you look at the very top right, or top left picture, that's Henry of Navarre. So Henry of Navarre was a Huguenot prince. If you guys remember, the Huguenots were French Calvinists. And so during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, he's able to escape. He gets out of the massacre, he gets out of it alive, doesn't get massacred with a lot of the other Huguenots in France. And as you guys recall, that was a big Catholic celebration day, and it turned into bloodshed when the Catholics ended up turning on the Huguenots and trying to kill as many of them as possible. So anyway, Henry of Navarre, he is going to escape and survive the day and go on to become a very prominent nobleman. Now then, he will marry the daughter of the queen. So he marries the daughter of Catherine, the Queen of France. And when Catherine dies, because he's married the daughter of the queen, he becomes the king. Okay, so he becomes Henry IV, which was the first king of the Bourbon dynasty. And so here we have Henry IV now as king, and he sets up this very strong dynasty. And he's also going to, interestingly enough, establish this kind of an interesting order called the Edict of Nantes. And the Edict of Nantes was a religious tolerance edict in France. In other words, it didn't matter what religion you were in France, you could be whatever you wanted to. At least that's, for a time, that was the case. And I think largely that was established because of the fact that he was a Huguenot and he dealt with a lot of persecution for a good number of years. So anyway, Henry IV, he establishes this Edict of Nantes, sets himself up as the king of France, and then he's going to start a dynasty. And you guys remember, a dynasty is a ruling family. So anyway, we have this Edict of Nantes. In 1610, Henry IV is traveling in a carriage, and a fanatic, who was a religious fanatic, he was very, very strongly Catholic, jumped into the royal carriage and stabbed the king to death. And that left his son, Louis XIII, in charge of the government. So here we have Louis XIII. He was really one of the most notable Louis, in that he really began to expand the power of the government. And we'll talk a little bit more here later about what that expansion looked like. But the first thing he did was, and this is pretty important for you guys today, he actually bought a little cottage in a place called Versailles. And Versailles was a little hamlet at the time, close to Paris. And so he begins to buy this little cottage, and it was a hunting cottage. It became his hunting lodge, and he begins to fix it up. And he will continue to fix it up and then pass it on to his son, Louis XIV, who will also continue to fix it up. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But Louis XIII, he knew he was a weak ruler, and he knew he needed a strong minister. Now, the way France was set up at this time, we didn't really quite have absolute rulers yet. The king had a job, and it was a very encompassing job, certainly. But he needed a minister to be the minister of state. And this first minister, first notable one anyway, is Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu was this very first minister, and he was actually kind of a controversial dude. If you guys are familiar with the Three Musketeers, the story of the Three Musketeers, they are fighting against the cardinals in France, Cardinal Richelieu, and then later Cardinal Mazarin. As the story goes, the Three Musketeers were against the strong power of Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu gave more and more power to the Bourbon family, and he did that by doing a couple of things. And this is kind of where the story of the Three Musketeers comes in, but we'll talk a little more on that later. First of all, if you were a Huguenot and you lived in a Huguenot city, he mandated that all walls were torn down in Huguenot cities. That meant that the Huguenot cities couldn't be defended. But then he took that another step further, and Richelieu decided that none of the nobles in France were allowed to live in castles anymore, which again meant they couldn't defend themselves. So ideally what he was doing was he was setting it up such that Huguenots nor nobles could ever really fight against the power of the government, because what ended up happening is they couldn't defend themselves. They had no ability to do so. So Richelieu then went to war with the Habsburgs, and this is called the 30 Years' War, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, so I just want to kind of give you guys a little backup information here. The Habsburgs were rulers in Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, and some parts of the Holy Roman Empire. We've got a couple of groups of H's for rulers, the Habsburgs, and we'll talk a little bit later about the Hohenzollerns, but the Habsburgs were who Richelieu went to fighting with, and we call this war the 30 Years' War. And that's on the heels of later on. We'll be talking about the 7 Years' War. And then also today, or a little bit later, we'll be talking about this War of Spanish Succession. So anyway, we've got the 30 Years' War. Richelieu is going to go to war with the Habsburgs. More on that later. So I wanted to come back to, I'll have you guys do some research on your own about the Palace of Versailles, and we'll come back to talk about it next time I'm with you. But I wanted to talk briefly about some notable writers. Michel de Montaigne, during this time frame, he kind of, a lot of these guys see the absolute power of Richelieu and the developing absolute power of Louis XIII, and they think to themselves, well, what's wrong with society that we have this? And so Montaigne kind of developed the essay to express thoughts and beliefs. And so, of course, you owe all your essays that you have to complete on a daily basis to this guy right here. So, sorry. So anyway, Montaigne develops this essay, and in this idea of the essay, he espouses that there's no absolute knowledge of truth. That's going to become very important here, because basically what Montaigne is doing is setting up kind of the belief of the scientific revolution, which we will also be talking about in the very near future. And so because of his belief that there's no absolute knowledge of truth, that kind of inspired a lot of scientists to dig to see if there really was absolute truth. And that was, like I said, what inspired the scientific revolution. Rene Descartes, one of my favorites, he was probably one of the strongest influences on modern philosophy and reasoning. He wrote a book called the Meditations, of First Philosophy. And in it, he said, he said it in Latin, dubito ergo cogito, cogito ergo sum, which means I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. And basically saying that we know we exist because we're capable of thought, which is kind of a cool concept anyway. And so Rene Descartes, he's kind of the father of modern philosophy and reasoning, and along with Montaigne, are really important. So these guys would develop skepticism, and basically skepticism is a belief that nothing could ever be known for certain. And that skepticism was pretty important, again, to the scientific revolution. And the scientific revolution was coming here soon. It's on its way, and we'll talk about that here in the next unit. So, all right. So briefly now, I want to kind of get started on him, what we call the Sun King. This is our old friend Louis the 14th. So upon Louis XIII's death, Louis XIV takes the throne, and he had a saying, "L'État c'est moi," which means I am the state. In other words, he really is just saying that I am the absolute ruler. Nothing gets done in the state unless it's done by me and unless I give it permission to be done. So Louis XIV really kind of becomes known as the absolute monarch of France. And we will talk more about him later, but suffice it to say, he is often called the Sun King. And the reason for that was because he was like the sun. And when he rose in the morning, everything he touched was influenced, everything he did was an influence. And in the evening, when it set, he was like the sun setting, and the influence was going away. So he was really the most important ruler. So I'll just leave you guys with this meme. They call me Ranch because I be dressing. There's a very classy picture, probably the most notable and most well-known picture of Louis XIV. It's actually in the Palace of Versailles. So if you go to the Palace of Versailles today, you can see this picture. It's about 9 foot tall, 9 foot tall painting, 6 foot wide. So pretty prominent. And again, you guys are going to do some research. So that leads me to what I want you guys to do today. I have for you guys this document right here. First of all, you have an assignment called The Cat and the King, which I want you to do that first. And The Cat and the King is a story, but it's kind of fun. I think you guys will like it. And then from there, I want you to go on to this. This is the Palace of Versailles and your opportunity to create your own Palace of Versailles. So what I want you to do is first, I want you to do some research on the Palace of Versailles. What was the Palace of Versailles like? What's it like inside? There's all kinds of great 360 views and move around things and that kind of stuff online, and you just need to go and look them up. And when you're done with that, then I want you to take what you learned from the Palace of Versailles and develop your own. So you're going to first design a floor plan, and that'll be on the front side of this sheet. I want you to come up with a floor plan, and if you're not sure what a floor plan is, you can look it up. And then I want you to come up with a front view. So on the second sheet, you're going to come up with a front view and show me what would your Palace of Versailles look like. Now, ideally, I want you guys to use some elements of the real Palace of Versailles in your Palace of Versailles. For example, you may want to consider adding a hall of mirrors, just like the Palace of Versailles has. So I'll leave that with you. That's what I want you guys to do the rest of the period. And after you do the Cat and the King thing, you can work on this as well, guys. Make it look great. You've got time in class to do it. So we'll examine these next time.